Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about what to look out for when buying a second-hand frame or bike. When buying something second-hand, especially for an online marketplace, you need to be super careful to make sure that what you're buying is indeed genuine and in good condition. We see many examples here at Carbon Bike Repair where customers have bought something that they believe to be genuine, and when it's here it's anything but. So here are some carbon and paint specific tips on things to look out for when buying something second-hand. So I'm going to use this full bike here as a blanket example, but I've also got examples of frames with the types of damage that I'm going to refer to in the video. Now when we check over parts specifically, that you have some sort of method. So for example, you could use the MECH method, which is following the frame in the shape of an M, to make sure that you're checking everything methodically, or go from front to back, but having some sort of system is good just to make sure that you don't miss out any damage. So the first thing to look for when buying a second-hand bike or frame is for any signs of trauma, because that will give you an indication if it's worth investigating deeper, which it always is generally. Straight away on this one, I'm seeing there are rips to both hoods, scuffs to the front of the shifter. I'm seeing rips to the bar tape on the non-drive side, scuffs to the skewer on the non-drive side. So perhaps the rider has fallen off on that side at some point and or has also come off on the front. And on the drive side, I'm also seeing marring and scuffs to the rear mech. So again, perhaps the bike was dropped or impacted on this side. The fact that this bike has marks on every single angle and side is a cause for concern. So two things to check before we actually start checking the frame. You can do this before the viewing. First of all, is the frame genuine? So you can have a look on the brand's websites that you're buying to see if that's a production model, to understand the characteristics of that brand. So do they have any quirky features that are particular to that brand? Most brands have an archive where if you know the year of the model that you're looking at, you can see if that's a production model as well and if it's the relevant paint scheme. So this, for example, as convincing as it looks, is actually a fake, often known as a China Rello. It's a fake because the chain suck plate, there isn't one, it's been painted on, and it's got the old Most graphic, not the new one. A genuine Pinarello would also use Torx bolts for the front hanger and the blanking plate, not hex bolts that protrude quite crudely in this fashion. There are a number of things on this frame that mark it as fake, but just do your research first, and it's always worth checking over for that. So the next thing to check is the paint from production, and that's also where you'll get the information by looking on the brand's website or going in the archive and seeing if the frame or bike that you're viewing is the correct colour scheme. If something's been custom sprayed or is not a manufactured finish, then that can raise some questions. The next thing to check, which is critical, is the fork, because if the fork is damaged, not everything is repairable on it, and if you know that you're in for a new fork straight away, then you need to consider if it makes economic sense pursuing the rest of the bike. So things to look out for on the fork, starting at the bottom, remove the wheel and then have a look at the dropouts to see if they're worn. It's not so much a problem on the front, we tend to see dropouts wearing more on the rear, but you're looking for a light bulb shape of the dropout and the wheel's not sitting in properly, perhaps from where it's not been tightened in properly. The next thing to check is if the bike that you're buying has a fork with an aluminium dropout that's then bonded to the carbon, is for separation, like on this one here. So what happens is over time the aluminium oxidizes against the carbon, and then there can be movement from where it separates. And this one's not too bad. You can see that we scraped away the paint. The symptom would be a lot of bubbling around the area, which you can still see some remnants of here. This one needs a couple of layers of carbon and then restoring the paint to sort it out. You then want to move up the blade of the fork, checking for any fracturing. So it's good to make sure that the fork is clean and the whole frame is clean by extension. Checking for any fracturing, perhaps shining a light on it or looking at it in sunlight. If there's any fracturing to the fork, again, not everything is repairable. Get in touch with us if you spot anything. Certainly full fractures on the blade, that's an instant no, and that's a new fork. Now we get up to the steerer and the crown area. So it's really important to check the steerer, because if that's broken anywhere, again, that's generally new fork time if it's fractured. If you can, remove the fork from the bike for this, if the seller will allow you, or afterwards. Perhaps before you remove it, you should check by holding on the shifter and then putting your hand on the upper bearing to see if you can get any movement, to see if the headset's loose. So when you remove the fork, you want to again carefully check the steerer. So this one's got a cracked steerer. So on here, this customer would either need to cut the fork down if he can achieve the resulting position, or replace the fork. The next thing to check for on a steerer is bearing wear. So for example, on this bike, it's got a very, very loose headset. So we need to see if that's caused any problems. You can see here there is a groove. Some cyclists refer to it as the ring of death, and that's from where the bearing has been loose and it's been rubbing around and has then imprinted on the steerer. If it's not too deep, this is repairable. We can relay carbon there to put it back up to how it's meant to be. You also want to check the crown area of the fork for any fracturing. Again, any fracturing here, game over for the fork, it's a new fork. So if you've managed to get the fork out, then ideally you can then have a look at the head tube. Check the head tube for any fracturing. If you've got the bearings, see how well they sit in there. If you haven't got the fork out, then you just need to check it visually, although that's not going to be the most accurate method. This particular frame has a fracture on the bearing surface here, and you can see it's quite grisly looking. It's certainly repairable, so if you do see any damage here, contact us. We can likely repair it for you, but it's one of the more involved and labour-intensive repairs, so it's not always the most economical option. And if you see anything here, then it might be an idea to walk away from buying the frame. If you found damage on the steerer or the crown, then if there's damage here as well, then you know that the frame has taken quite a big impact. Check visually for any damage. Again, making sure that the frame is clean. You're checking for any fractures. This one's got a fracture on the non-drive side top tube, so this will need to be repaired before it's safe to ride. So as you're checking the top tube and down tube as well, pay attention if there's any cable guides and bottle cage bolts. So this one, for example, has a snapped cable guide, and this one has no replacement with it. So it's a case of finding something that will work where the holes of the guide align with the holes in the frame. And if they are on the frame, just give them a wiggle to see if they're loose, because that could be a sign of some damage. With the bottle cage bolts, it's probably a good idea to remove them, because if you've got any that are tight to remove, it could be a sign that the rivet nut's gone or there's damage. So for example, on this frame here, this bolt here is the offending item. It's properly stuck in there and it will not be coming out without a fight, it's just spinning. So again, that's something that needs to be sorted and something that you should know when you're checking over the frame. So now that you've checked the top tube and down tube, you now want to check the seat tube. So starting at the top of the seat tube, particularly at the clamp area, you want to check if that's all okay. This one has the classic over-tightening of the seat clamp where it's been over-torqued. You can see there's a fracture here by the slot hole and also one at the front, so that will need to be repaired. Now you want to visually check down the seat tube. If it's an aero profile seat post, you want to check where the post meets the cutout of the frame, that there's no fracturing there, because that can sometimes happen if the post has been rammed down too far. So now we get to the front MECH area. This is a really critical component to check. Most frames have a hanger that is riveted on, and you want to check for any play in the hanger. This one has a little bit, and you want to check for any fracturing coming out of the rivet holes. And this one is a bit strange because it looks like it's been broken at some point and then it's been reattached in the wrong place, because you can see that was where the original rivet hole was. So this will need sorting out. If it's a metal interface here, again, like on the dropouts, you want to check for any bubbling of the paint and separation. again, that will need to be sorted if that's going on there. So now we get to the BB area. If you can, remove the cranks. If you can't, then you want to wiggle the cranks for any play, but it's really best taking it out. Rob's done an excellent video on different types of bottom brackets in terms of things to watch out for, so I won't go into too much detail, but essentially things to look out for are if it's aluminium, if there are signs of the sleeve debonding, and if it's carbon, if there is wear around the shell, and this China Rello again happens to have both. So again, that's quite a labour-intensive repair, and if you spot this damage when you're viewing the frame, it's probably best to walk away. We now go to the rear end. So again, visually checking the seat stays and the chain stays carefully for any damage. If there's any fracturing, contact us. That's quite a straightforward repair. And you want to check, ideally by removing the rear wheel, for any signs of abrasion damage. For example, where two wider tyres have been used, all the wheels not sitting in the dropouts correctly. This frame here is a prime example of abrasion damage. You've got abrasion damage on the stays, on the BB junction, and you can see here it's actually going in, almost worn a hole into the carbon. You've got abrasion on the stays as well, again indicative of too wide a tyre being used. Again, that's something that we can sort out, so contact us if you spot that damage on a frame. So the final thing to check is the dropouts. So ideally, if you've got the rear wheel off, that would be good. And the first thing to check for, similar to the cable guides and bottle cage bolts, are the hanger bolts. So quite often these are one or two really quite small bolts, and you want to see if you can undo them. It's super annoying when you've got one in there and it won't undo and it just spins in there, and you then have to carefully prise it out. And then the next thing is for dropout wear. So if the wheel's not been sitting in the frame properly over time, it can dig into the dropout. This one's not too bad, but when it's really bad, you get like a light bulb shaped on the inside face of the dropout. And if you've got abrasion on the frame, such as this as well, and this is also a sign that there's something wrong with the dropouts. Because the wheel's not sitting properly in the frame, the tyre then rubs on the chainstay. So this needs sorting. And then the final thing is to check for any fracturing at the dropout. This one, you can see it's just cleanly sheared off. This is a really complex repair, but it is achievable when it's a carbon dropout, so we can certainly help there. The final thing on dropouts would be, like on the fork at the beginning of the video, if it's an aluminium insert into carbon, like on the fork, to check for any separation or bubbling of the paint as well. Of course, as well as all the carbon and paint specific tips that we've just run through, it's always a good idea to also check the mechanical components of the bike to make sure that they're in good condition, to avoid racking up a large service bill or having to replace parts, because that obviously comes into the economics of buying a second-hand product. It's always a good idea to make sure that the owner has genuinely purchased the frame. You can also send your frame in here for a health check. We've got all the equipment here and many years of experience, so we can confidently check your frame over and give you that peace of mind that you may need. If you like what you're seeing on the channel, then please like and subscribe for more videos. And if you've got any video ideas or any comments or any questions, then please put them below.